Sunday, August 29. We've been spending some time this summer reflecting on passages we find in the Gospels that describe incredible acts of healing that individuals received when they were in the presence of Jesus. And I think when we read passages like these and think about them, sometimes we might feel a little envious of people who were alive when Jesus was alive and engaged in his public ministry. We might feel as if we miss out somewhat because they had such incredible and open access to miracles. And perhaps especially if we're dealing with some kind of struggle in our lives, or if a loved one is dealing with some kind of a health issue, a disease that seems hopeless, we sometimes wish if only we could be in the company of Jesus, as so many were that we read about in the Gospels. Just the touch that Jesus gave brought immediate healing, or the words that he spoke. We're going to reflect on another passage recorded in Luke chapter 8. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record this incredible story. And as we think about that, I'd like us to think about how the kind of healing that this individual received was much more than just physical healing, as incredible as that was. And this speaks to the kind of healing that we can still receive from the hand of Jesus today, the true miracle that is as evident and available for people today as it ever was. So let's hear these words recorded in Luke chapter 8, verses 42 to 48. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind Jesus and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." What an incredible story. You get the sense there at the very beginning of the passage that there was a reason why crowds of people were pressing up against Jesus. Wherever Jesus went in his public ministry, people followed him because they knew that he had incredible power to heal. And that's why so many brought their diseased loved ones and friends to Jesus, because they knew that when they were in the company of Jesus of Nazareth, they were in the company of someone who had power to heal. And so again, that makes us a little envious. We think perhaps if only we were there then, or if Jesus was as accessible to us today as he was then. Think of the miracles that he could do in the world today. Well, in response to that, I think at least two things need to be said. First, miracles still happen today. In fact, I think they happen far more often than we may realize. People are still healed in ways that are unexplainable as far as a medical or a scientific perspective is concerned. Perhaps some of you are familiar with the Alpha series. It's a very impactful series of videos that are shared in the context of a shared meal. It's very unfortunate that at this time so many people are not able to experience the power and the beauty of Alpha because of the COVID pandemic. Some years ago, we had an Alpha series here in the church where I serve as pastor. Nikki Gumbel is an amazing Bible teacher who developed this series that probes into some of the very simple and basic teachings about our Christian faith. Who is God? How do we read the Bible? How can we pray? What do we do with suffering? And one of the topics was on the subject of healing. And he affirmed, as I shared with you a few moments ago, that miracles still happen. And there were, in fact, some incredible testimonies of present-day miracles that were shared in that video. And so miracles still happen in the world today. That's the first thing. And the second, even more important thing to notice when it comes to us feeling a little envious of people who had such incredible access to healing centuries ago, the second thing to notice is that no matter how disappointed we may feel about that, there is a far greater healing that we can experience today than physical healing. I mean, the healing stories in the Gospels are incredible. Jesus even raises the dead. But there is a greater healing even than that available to us. It's not so much a physical healing, but a spiritual healing, the forgiveness of sins, a relationship with God that is restored, the promise of spending eternity with God in the kingdom of heaven, where there is no longer any disease or death or war or poverty or anything like the kind of things that we struggle against in our lives today. So that's another very important thing for us to remember. And in fact, this passage that I read to you is not just a healing story in the sense that this woman is healed after 12 years of suffering. I mean, that's incredible in itself. But there is also a deeper spiritual healing that is present here as well. And I will share a little bit more about that with you too. The point for us is, we may not be able to have the physical contact with Jesus as so many did centuries ago. We cannot reach out and touch him, nor is he physically present as he once was, so he can reach out and physically touch us. But there is still a way for us to be in touch with Jesus in a very powerful way. And I think that's what this passage of the Bible is really hinting at today as well. So let's explore that a little bit further. The woman in this story has suffered for 12 years. She had some kind of health issue in her life that rendered her not only physically diseased, but spiritually, because of her constant bleeding, she would have been ostracized from the community. She would have been someone who was unclean because of her bleeding. And so she had not only a physical situation that was difficult, but a spiritual one as well, a relational one. She was alone in her suffering. But she believed that Jesus of Nazareth, as so many others believed, had power to heal. Even if she only touched the edge of his cloak, his robe, she believed, that would be enough for her to experience incredible healing. And no sooner does she touch the edge of the Lord's robe and she feels power in her body, healing power. The bleeding stops. And Jesus also notices that as this woman touches the edge of his cloak, he also feels power leaving from him to change the life and situation that this woman was dealing with. And it's all because she touched the edge of his robe, just the edge of his robe. Now you might think, how is that possible? Especially when you consider, as Peter says, so many people were crowding up against Jesus, pressing up against him. How could the Lord have even known that someone touched just the edge of his cloak? She didn't even touch his body, just the fabric. How could he have noticed that? Well, it's very interesting when you consider why the woman did this. Luke doesn't exactly tell us all of the reasons why she did. We're kind of left wondering about that perhaps after Jesus and the woman speak. She explains there, kneeling at the feet of Jesus, why she did what she did. And Matthew, in his account of this story, indicates that the woman did this before she did it because she believed even touching the edge of his cloak would heal her. It's almost as if you're given an opportunity to read her mind and think her thoughts. If I only touch the edge of his cloak, I will be healed. That's why she did this. Now that's incredible. It's important for us to think about the robe that Jesus was wearing. He was an observant Jew, and like every observant Jewish man, Jesus wore what we today would call a prayer shawl. In Hebrew, it's called a talit. We read in the Old Testament about this robe was supposed to look like. In Numbers 15, for example, we read that this robe or this shawl was to have 4 corners at the bottom, so it would be kind of square at the bottom of it. Also, at each of the four corners of this robe, a tassel needed to be attached. We read, for instance, in Numbers 15, verse 38, where God says to Moses, "Throughout the generations to come, you are to make tassels on the corners of your garments, with a blue cord on each tassel." It's interesting to note here that the word translated as corner is the Hebrew word for wing. So the wings or the edges or the corners of this robe is where the four tassels were to appear. Observant Jews still today wear this kind of robe with tassels on the four corners. In fact, if you've seen Jewish people pray, perhaps at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, you might see people actually cover their heads with this prayer shawl. They lift it up and cover their heads with it. It's a very descriptive way of suggesting that they are sheltered by the presence of God. It's an act of humility. They are recognizing how small they are in the presence of the great God to whom they pray. But it's also a covering, a sign of protection. It's sort of like what we read in Psalm 91. Those who dwell in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty, under His wings. Interesting word, same Hebrew word as corner, the corner of the garments. Under His wings you will find refuge. So this is the kind of robe or cloak that Jesus was wearing. The word that we read in verse 44 that's translated as the edge of His cloak is a very specific word. It means tassel. The very thing that the Old Testament describes as being the knotted and twisted bits of wool that needed to be attached to the four wings or corners of the prayer shawl. Now, it's interesting to note that this is the specific part of the Lord's robe that the woman reached out to touch. Why did she do it? Well, as we read in verse 47, she told Jesus why she had touched the edge of His robe. And again, as Matthew suggests, she did it because she knew even touching that tassel, the edge, would bring healing. She knew that the wings of the Lord's robe had power to heal. Now, what would have made her think that? Some suggest that there was a specific legend about the Messiah's prayer shawl. When the Messiah would come, the prayer shawl that He would wear would have healing powers, that even the wings, the corners, the tassels would have powers to heal. They base this prophecy or this legend on the prophecy found in Malachi chapter 4, verse 2. It might sound familiar because the Easter hymn, "Christ the Lord is risen today," is based on that verse. "But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its wings." Wings. Same Hebrew word again. Wings. So it's possible that people believed that the wings of the coming Messiah's prayer robe would have healing power. It's apparently what this woman believed. And it's interesting that in Mark's rendition or account of this story, in Mark chapter 5, the very next chapter, includes another very striking reference to the healing power of Jesus. Jesus has crossed the Sea of Galilee, and again, crowds of people are there waiting for Him on the other side, and they bring to Jesus all kinds of sick people, carrying them on their mats, and they begged Jesus to let them touch even the edge of His cloak. Same word as in the scripture reading from Luke's gospel today, the edge, the corner, the wing of His prayer shawl, which refers again to the tassels that would be found on those four corners, and all who touched Him were healed in Mark chapter 5. Now, whether this woman wanted to touch a tassel on the Lord's robe because she was aware of the prophecy in Malachi 4 verse 2 and believed that the coming Messiah's prayer shawl, even the tassels on the corners of it, would have healing powers, that's obviously a subject of debate, and it's really not that important. Because there was nothing magical about the Lord's robe or the tassels on the four corners of it. It was the person who wore the robe that mattered most. Not the robe, but the one who wore it. Think about this. Think about robes in the Old Testament. Elijah, the great prophet, had a mantle, a cloak that he wore. And when he was taken up to heaven in chariots of fire, his mantle, his cloak is left behind. And when Elisha picks it up, it has the same power for healing and miracles that it had when Elijah wore it. So the mantle is passed on from Elijah to Elisha. So he now has authority and power. Think too about how when David has an opportunity to kill King Saul, when he creeps up on him in his cave, what does he do? Doesn't kill him. He cuts the corner of his robe. Why did he do that? Well, he was sending a message. Not only that he spared Saul's life, but that he could have taken the life of the Lord's anointed one, which is why David says he won't kill him. How can I kill the Lord's anointed one, the Messiah? He cuts the corner of the robe to indicate that he submits even to Saul and his authority. It's not the robe, it's the one who wears the robe. Think about the story of Ruth and Boaz. You remember perhaps how Ruth is lying out there by the threshing floor one night, and Boaz finds her there, amazed to find her there. And what does Ruth say? Cover me with the corners of your robe, the wings, literally. Now, it's not just that Ruth was feeling cold there on the threshing floor and needed a blanket. No, she was asking Boaz to cover her vulnerability, to claim her as his wife, to be the one who would protect her, cover her, to be the strength that she needed. Now, all of this helps to explain why the woman reached out and touched the tassel of the Lord's robe, and why Jesus noticed that she did. It was her way of acknowledging that he was one with authority, with healing power. It was, in fact, as Jesus said to her, an act of faith. Your faith has healed you. She recognized who he was. And here's why this is so important for us. Not everyone who is in contact with Jesus still today touches him in this way as an act of faith. They might be familiar with Jesus. They might have been raised by Christian parents or perhaps gone to church. If they're filling out a census form, they may identify themselves as Christian. But what does it really mean? They're in touch with Jesus, familiar with him, but do they have a relationship with him? You see, this speaks to the ultimate healing that this woman received from the Lord. It wasn't just that her physical healing occurred, that 12 years of bleeding miraculously stopped. That's incredible. But what does Jesus call her? Daughter, daughter, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. Now, this speaks to the same kind of spiritual healing that you and I can experience today, whereby a broken relationship is restored. We who, like this woman, are diseased in the most profound sense, cursed because of our sin and shame, are restored to a relationship with God in and through Jesus Christ. So he calls you, daughter, son. You're a part of God's family again. This is why being in touch with Jesus for us still today is incredibly powerful and miraculous. We are restored, not only physically, but spiritually. We have the opportunity of spending a life in relationship with Jesus now and forever one day. This is why we shouldn't feel envious about people who received the healing touch of Jesus centuries ago. We can receive the power that Jesus came to bring, that restores us, that heals us. He took our curse on himself so that the bleeding of our sin, non-stop uncleanness and shame, would end. He took it to his cross, where his robe was taken from him. His robe. He was left alone on his cross of shame, taking only our sin and curse. And rising with healing in his wings, he calls you son. He calls you daughter. If you believe who he is, it's not the robe, it's the one who wears the robe. That's the most important part. And he still is there for us to reach out to today. And as we do that, we experience incredible healing. And he says to us, in all of the struggles we face, go in peace. I hope that this message has reminded you of how incredible it is to be in touch with Jesus, living in a relationship that he has created for us, a life of deep healing and everlasting peace. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope it's been encouraging to you. Be well.